Hello, and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. I am your host, Steve Halley. With me, as per usual, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. Galen, how is the new term treating you? How are you living, buddy?
Underwater, man. Week
Underwater.
weekend. What's that line from Tropic Thunder? The film is 3 weeks behind schedule, 3 days into filming or something like that.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so you're not just treading water; you're actually sinking.
Yeah, but what else is new?
What else? You've done this for a while. You'll recover. Plus, you're a buoyant individual, so I'm
Yeah,
not too worried about you.
I like to think so. I
Yeah.
also just need to learn how to work faster. What's up with you, man?
Same thing, except in the tech world, basically. We had our company's official launch this week, which went very well and
Congratulations.
thank you. It was exciting. And that just basically 10X's our work. So, but in a good way. Like that's a successful launch. That's what you want. So,
More success, more problems.
yeah, exactly. This is what and I think you do for fun on our off hours. And it's fun to think about stuff like an accidental drone strike on Poland from Russia.
Accidental.
Yeah, that's how we have fun. And again, not the best transition. But we're here to have fun, right, Galen?
Again, I give the A for effort. So,
Yeah, you're always gonna get the effort from me. Like, yeah, just like the Russians. Yeah, you're always gonna get the effort, right?
yeah.
They're
All
well
right.
known for that. So we'll lay out kind of what happened earlier this week. We're recording on Friday, as we usually do. On Wednesday, Poland had a mass incursion of, I think, between 10 and 20 Russian drones. Now, Poland is saying 19 is the number. NATO is a little bit more circumspect about that still, which I think is interesting. I'll just lay out the general circumstances of what happened. They basically had to scramble air defenses over the course of about 7 hours in the sort of early morning of Wednesday, earlier this week. Drones were flying in from Belarus and also from the airspace of Ukraine. Putting this in context, Ukraine usually absorbs, several hundred drone strikes, missile strikes, airstrikes on a daily basis now. They shoot most of those down. Poland, less ready to do so, less ready to deal with between 10 and 20 drones. These drones apparently were sort of a cheaper knockoff that the Russians make of the Iranian Shahed model. So, sort of fixed wing, relatively cheap, usually carries an explosive payload. But apparently, this model of drone, which is called the Garin or Garin 2, is also used as decoys. So they won't necessarily carry explosive payloads. And I think this is interesting because there were no reports of explosions in or over Poland that I read about. But this caused mass panic, shut down Polish airspace over the entire eastern part of the country for basically half a day. NATO scrambled jets.
And
So
some were shot down, correct?
yes, yeah, they were able to shoot some down. One crashed into somebody's house and basically took out the roof of some dude's house. Nobody died, but like people very easily could have died, even if these weren't equipped with explosive payloads. And I want to be clear, incidents like this have happened since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Even just a few months ago, an errant drone crashed into a field in eastern Poland. There have been scares surrounding missiles earlier in the war, again, hitting Polish territory. It's important also to note that Poland hosts one of the main logistics bases for NATO and the United States to supply Ukraine with weapons. The Russians are obviously pretty unhappy about this. If you ask the Poles, they are absolutely certain that this was not an accident. There's no way that 19 drones could have all gone haywire and crashed in Poland. One analyst pointed out that if you are looking at the map in terms of countries that border Ukraine, there's also Hungary and I believe Slovakia. And none of the errant drones hit those countries, which are more aligned with Russia than Poland is. Poland is very, very anti-Russian. So that was kind of an interesting point. The Russians said, hey, this was due to Ukrainian jamming, which could be true potentially. We'll get into that. But they've effectively denied responsibility and sort of gaslit both Poland and NATO for going crazy over this sort of non-event. Now, we'll also talk about whether or not this should be considered a non-event. We'll get into the context of sort of provocations between Russia and NATO historically, because there are many. Needless to say that Poland invoked Article 4 of the NATO agreement in response to this incursion, which basically leads the alliance to conduct security consultations. It is not an invocation of Article 5, which has only been invoked once in the history of NATO.
I think this was only the 8th time Article 4 has been invoked.
Yes. And it was probably invoked at the outset of the Ukraine war. And
I think I read that. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, you're right. But it is pretty darn rare considering the long history of NATO at this point, 75 years.
Yeah.
So this, to the Poles at least, this is not an insignificant incident in any way.
I mean, look, Donald Tusk, the prime minister in Poland, guy is good with quotes. I didn't really quite know what to make of this one since it was like immediately contradicting himself. He said, "This is the closest we have been to open conflict since World War II," but then added that there was, quote, "no reason to believe we're on the brink of war," end quote.
Okay. So we've drawn closer, but we're not on the brink.
Yeah,
it does actually kind of make sense to me, depending on how far away you think those two things are.
Look, I don't know what to make of it. I just know that guy's really great quote back in March. He said, "I'll repeat once again what seems incredible, but is true. 500 million Europeans are begging 300 million Americans to protect us from 180 million Russians who have not been able to cope with 40 million Ukrainians for 3 years."
I love that so much. And like, when you hear something that perfect, that perfectly formulated, you're like, okay, did he workshop that? Or did he actually just pull that out on the fly? Because that's brilliant. In terms of like the reaction of the Europeans, the Europeans do not believe this to be an accident. Again, NATO is being more circumspect. The Supreme Commander of NATO is hedging his language very carefully. He's also American. President Donald Trump remarked, well, could have been an accident. He's kind of making those kinds of noises. Donald Tusk, in response to that particular tweet, said, "We would love to believe that this was an accident, but it absolutely wasn't."
Yeah.
Pretty much in those words. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But yeah, this does seem to be an incident that, at least to the Eastern Europeans, is a big deal. And because of that invocation of Article 4, is a big deal for NATO.
And just to clarify, because you did a deeper dive on this part than I did, like you said, this isn't the first time Russian drones have breached NATO airspace, but the depth of the incursion and the number of drones was significantly larger than.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for underlining that. Yeah. Like in the handful of times this has happened before since the Ukraine war started, we're talking about like one drone goes haywire and crashes, or like one like missile defense missile, which ended up actually being from Ukraine, ended up in Poland. But there was a big to-do about this. Obviously, it's NATO territory. And the idea behind NATO is, Joe Biden said, "We will defend every square inch of NATO territory," quote unquote. And that is still, I think, the official position of the United States. Now, the actual position of the United States remains to be seen. And so that's also interesting. The Russians love plausible deniability, right, Galen? That's what they're all about. And
I mean, doesn't everyone?
Yeah, everybody does, but like they particularly love it. And they've gotten pretty good at sort of these types of provocations that cannot be deemed obvious acts of war.
Yeah, the little green men in eastern Ukraine, like
severing underseas communication cables, assassinating people, cyber attacks, you name it, right? We call it gray zone warfare.
Yeah, and leaving aside again, like it almost certainly was not an accident based on the reporting I've seen, but like I only have access to what's out there just as you do. Like assuming that it was a deliberate incursion, This is where, like, even if everyone knows it was you, having plausible deniability can be useful. Like, everyone knew the United States was arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s,
Mm,
but the fact that it was technically covert made it easier to avoid a direct clash between the superpowers. Yeah, I mean, gray zone tactics for the most part, if this indeed should be considered that, you see it a lot in the context of like China with Taiwan.
hmm.
It's basically exploiting one of the classic dilemmas of deterrence, which is declaring that you are going to take action in the case of X means that anything not X could conceivably be viewed as fair game. Like, one classic example of this, going back to our grad school days, learning about this in US foreign policy classes, was the outbreak of the Korean War. So the Secretary of State at that time, Dean Acheson, notably did not include South Korea within the US defense perimeter. If memory serves, I actually think Stalin had initially told Kim Il sung not to invade South Korea to avoid a potential confrontation with the Americans. But when he heard Acheson say that South Korea was not specifically within the US defense perimeter, he changed his mind. And ultimately, the United States did go to war in Korea. So it's
Yeah.
exploiting that gap. It also is alternatively exploiting like the threshold, which is
Hmm.
more what this one was, right? This was a violation of a red line, that being Polish territory, and Poland is a member of the NATO alliance, but it was done at a relatively low threshold. It remains to be seen what Poland or NATO's response, if any, is going to be to this. But certainly no one's expecting, a full scale nuclear conflict or a NATO invasion of Russia or something like that. It was at such a low scale that no one is really thinking there's going to be a major escalation here. It's kind of maybe probing or testing on the Russians' part. I guess we'll talk about why Putin might have been doing this later on. Uh, but in the same way, you see China doing things like buzzing Taiwanese airspace or harassing ships, stuff that's low level, but could conceivably lead to some sort of an incident, or at the very least is probing one's defenses or probing the commitment of allies in a way that's relatively low risk. Whereas, if Russian tanks were rolling across the Polish border, that would be a different story.
Yeah, that's very clearly a green light to conflict versus the red light of clearly staying away from Polish sovereign territory, right? And there's a whole gap in the middle that is basically yellow light, which is what you're talking about, or the gray zone. Thomas Schelling also referred to this idea as salami tactics.
Yes.
And he told the story of a kid who has been told not to go in the pool into no uncertain terms, but gets very close to the pool and looks in. And then maybe almost touches the pool with his toe, but doesn't do it. And then sticks his toe in the water. And pretty soon he's got his whole foot. And then he's in the pool, right? And he's testing. He's waiting to see whether the parent is going to respond. The parent doesn't necessarily want to respond because it's expensive to respond, right? It's a pain
Yeah.
in the butt to like discipline your children or go to war, right? But if like there's utility in basically degrading the strength of that credibility, of that promise to defend every square inch, right? It's like, well, like what about these square inches that got hit by these decoys, if that's in fact what they were, right?
Right.
Maybe it's not, it's so clear cut. So it starts to erode, that promise. And it doesn't help when the main guarantor of security in NATO, the United States, is itself sort of ambiguous in its
Right.
response.
That's the advantage of ambiguity. Again, you see this all the time with debates over Taiwan, as we've spoken about earlier on the show. Like, it gives you more wiggle room, it gives you
Mm-hmm.
more flexibility, and you can be a little less clear about what the red line is, which in some ways is advantageous. The downside is it's arguably inviting the behavior that you would prefer not to see happen.
Exactly.
And I
Yeah, there's a
always love the
trade-off.
shelling stuff just because, like, here's a Nobel Prize winning economist who says, like, a lot of what he learned about this stuff came from negotiating with his kids. And it's true. Like, you watch parents and kids, like, when they got to leave the park or something, and parents are like, I'm going to count to three,
Yeah.
1, 2, 2.5,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? Like,
You don't want to have that confrontation, right?
yeah.
Because it's just like, it's so like soul sapping. And yeah, I could probably write a book on deterrence and compellence in parenting theory. I don't have time to do that, but I certainly practice it, not very well, I might add.
And the other thing here, like, the fact that this does involve allies
Hmm.
means there's potential for discordance in the response. Like, clearly the Poles have a very like understandable view of how they're thinking about this and don't think it was an accident at all and are probably quite concerned about whether this is some sort of precursor to something else that directly affects their security. I'll hold off on, again, why the Russians might be doing this for the time being, but the way that Spain, which is in NATO, is thinking
Hmm.
about, or Turkey or the United States for that matter, is arguably quite a bit different. And so, you know, stuff like this reveals those tensions, and perhaps that's part of the game plan here.
Yeah. So to be clear, NATO and the Europeans have certainly responded pretty strongly. So it's NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in a press conference said it's reckless and unacceptable. We can't have Russian drones entering Allied airspace. During the announcement of Operation Eastern Sentry, which begins this evening. So, we're recording in California, so it's already started in Europe, basically. So, major allies, including Denmark, France, Britain, and Germany, are all going to be involved. They've all committed to the mission. Others are set to join. I don't know if Spain's going to join or not, but like that's a good example, right? And in terms of like the assets that we're talking about here, it's pretty modest, right? Sort of underlying the point that without the United States involved, it matters a lot less what's going on in NATO. We're looking at 2 F-16 fighter jets and a frigate from Denmark, 3 Rafale fighter jets from France, and 4 Eurofighter jets from Germany, which is like, it's not nothing, but it's also kind of like pocket change by the standards of like the active war going on in Ukraine. So unless the United States comes in and says, all right, we're going to contribute to this in a real way, which I think, assuming that this is a gray zone tactic, Vladimir Putin and the Russians are watching out for.
Yeah, I mean, plausibly could be the point, right?
Yeah, the whole point.
Well, this, yeah.
Yeah. We'll get into that. But like before we do that, I think it would be useful to get a little bit of historical context around confrontations, active confrontations between NATO and Russia and or the Soviet Union, because NATO's been around for 75 years. Russia and the Soviet Union, formerly the Soviet Union, had been around longer than that. And we got to ask the question, well, how big of a deal is this really? Right? It involves drones, which have not always existed. But, you can also say drones don't include pilots. That's kind of notable, right? And they didn't seem to have any explosives on board, although that's not reported, right? So it's like exactly how much of a provocation is this? How precisely was it calibrated relative to other incidents in the past?
Yeah. And I'm going to preface this by saying it is entirely possible and indeed likely that I either am not aware of other instances and or have forgotten about them, which happens more and more these days. I had a bit of a tough time coming up with significant ones. I came up with 4, arguably, like only 2 of which were major confrontations, and both involved Germany and Berlin during the Cold War. So the first is when Stalin decided to blockade Berlin in 1948. Now, to be clear, NATO has not come into existence just yet. It's about less than a year away before the treaty is, I think it's April 1949. Now, that is before Stalin decides to end the blockade, but nevertheless, this is a confrontation that he's deliberately stoked with the West. There's all sorts of nitty-gritty details you could go into here and, the ins and outs of why he did this. But in broad terms, it was the Soviets reacting to their fear of a resurgent Germany that the West might be thinking about using against them. Again, the Soviets lose an astronomical number of people during the Second World War. At this point, we're only about 3 years out.
Still recovering, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But major worries about the resurrection of German power. The immediate spark for this is sort of, you know, Germany had been divided among the Allies after the war and split between its eastern and western parts. Ditto for Berlin. The Western Allies had sort of decided to pool their zones of occupation and were not only issuing Marshall Plan aid, which Stalin considered a major threat, but also introducing a new German currency. And this all kind of prefaced the resurrection of the German economy and potentially German power, because the thinking on the Western side was you couldn't have a solid economic recovery without Germany involved. And so that's the immediate spark. And essentially why Stalin decides to do this is he's maybe seeing if the West decides to abandon Germany, because as I think we've spoken about in an earlier episode, West Berlin is 100 miles or so inside of East German territory. And so it's highly exposed to Soviet power. Now, Truman decides that he's not going to back down, and ultimately the decision is made to launch an air bridge. And quite remarkably, the United States keeps West Berlin supplied for just about a year.
Completely insane, right?
Like enormous logistical move. I mean, and this ends up being kind of a disaster in PR terms for Stalin, like there's the candy bomber on the US side who flies over West Berlin and drops candies down to children in West Berlin. By contrast, the Soviets look like real bullies. Now, it's worth noting at the time, by the way, the U.S. atomic monopoly is still in place. I don't think that's the whole story. Stalin would not have wanted another major conflict so soon out from having just defeated Nazi Germany. But that's certainly a major test of Western resolve and maybe like the proto-NATO period. The second example also involves Berlin. And since we've already talked about it on this show, I'll be brief, but a similar set of dynamics. Now Nikita Khrushchev is the general secretary, and he wants to resolve the German problem. His worst nightmare is a West Germany armed with nuclear weapons, which could conceivably exploit some sort of crisis in East Germany to try to reunify Germany by force. And that was considered a vital threat to the Soviets. So both under Eisenhower and then again under Kennedy, Khrushchev basically threatens to sign a separate peace with the East Germans, which would involve de facto recognition of East Germany, which would put U.S.-West German relations in a real bind. Again, this is a city that can only be defended with nuclear weapons. This kind of culminates in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this is probably, in my opinion, the single most dangerous crisis of the entire Cold War. And again, it's the Soviets using Berlin kind of as a hostage to achieve their political objectives about the German problem and or to test Western resolve on the matter.
More dangerous than Cuba?
So I kind of view Cuba as like the culmination of the Second Berlin Crisis.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. That makes sense.
I view those crises as intimately connected. I mean, and I get that from, our former mentor, Mark Trachtenberg, who talk circles around both of us on this.
Absolutely. So how did that crisis culminate? And
well, Cuba scares the hell out of everyone. And quite aside from that, reveals that the U.S. kind of won that test. Fortunately, there was a diplomatic agreement that everyone could live with.
Yeah.
This is the last chapter of Trachtenberg's book, where he kind of talks about this mini settlement of 1963, which is, okay, the Soviets are not going to harass West Berlin anymore. U.S. and Western access rights are assured. In exchange, the Americans will make sure that the West Germans do not get an independent nuclear capability. And what that means is that the United States is going to have to stay committed to Europe's defense with American troops on the ground indefinitely.
Which is what happens. And that independent aspect of nuclear capability is pretty important.
Hugely important.
Yeah, because NATO has American tactical nuclear weapons stationed on in basically Western European territory, and the doctrine around those changes
Oh yeah,
several
I mean,
times.
again, this is all Marx stuff, but
Yeah,
Eisenhower very much in favor of actually sharing nuclear weapons, including with the West Germans. So
yeah, that would have been a red line. Everybody steps back from the brink there, thankfully, because that was extremely high stakes.
yeah. Now, I mean, we should say the blockade, you could argue, does involve crossing a certain red line in that it violates the Allies' agreement on access rights to Berlin, but there's no
Mhm.
shooting that goes on.
That's why blockades are really nice, right?
Right.
To whatever extent a gray zone tactic is intended to put the ball in the other party's court, right? Which is pretty much always the case. It's like, all right, we did this. Now, what are you going to do? Ball's in your court.
And that's, by the way, since we mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, that's why Kennedy went with a
A
blockade.
blockade. Yeah,
Called it a quarantine, but yeah, basically said, okay, now the Soviet.
nobody dies immediately, and it is up to you whether you want to break the blockade. And obviously, if you start breaking the blockade, people are going to die. So it's your fault. The ball's in your court, right?
Yep. And this is, since you mentioned Schelling, this is, one of his big points. You want to relinquish the initiative. You want to make the other side have to take the final decisive step that
Yep.
brings things over the brink.
Because they're more likely to back down. Because people are scared, especially when nuclear weapons are involved.
Yeah, I mean, as they should be.
Yes.
The second set doesn't really involve. I mean, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis involves the Soviets putting missiles in the Western Hemisphere, but it doesn't involve any kinetic or military actions. So even those are a bit different from what I'd say we're talking about today. The third case I looked at, which was, I'll just say right now, I highly recommend reading article by Simon Miles, who I think is still at Duke. I would have to check. He wrote a lengthier piece in the Journal of Cold War Studies and a shorter piece that's accessible online in War on the Rocks, about the Able Archer exercises of 1983. Famous kind of Cold War episode. So just to put this in context, there's a lot of, some people view when Reagan becomes president as the start of the second Cold War, when things escalate quite dramatically. Now, why is that? And some people think 1983, with the exception of 1962, might be the most dangerous year of the Cold War. A few things go on. One, the Western Allies do something called Fleet X 83-1, which I believe are the largest military exercises since World War II. And the idea is kind of to stoke paranoia on the Soviet side and to, try to buzz their airspace and see if, you can outflank their air defenses. This is one of the reasons, arguably, that the Soviets accidentally shoot down a civilian Korean airliner later in the year, which was a major incident, killed something like 269 civilian passengers.
Everybody. Yep.
Because they had kind of been embarrassed by the Fleet X exercises earlier in the year. This is, after Reagan has announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, which
Star Wars,
which ultimately came to naught. And,
yeah.
Ballistic missile defense remains extremely difficult to do.
Although Trump's Golden Dome idea is actively
there are examples of, right, the Israelis' Iron Dome. But, here we're talking about shooting down things like ICBMs and
from space in particular.
Yes.
So,
but at the time, no one knew if the tech would work, and the Soviets couldn't know if there was something classified in the works. So that worried them. They were already worried about the decreasing potency of their nuclear deterrent and that the Americans might have achieved strategic superiority. So that ratcheted up tensions. There's an incident in September where a guy named Stanislav Petrov detected incoming on the Soviet computer systems, incoming attack from the West, nuclear missiles.
This is an amazing story. Yeah.
He actually didn't bother alerting his higher ups because he deduced quite accurately, if this were a bolt from the blue, surely the West would have shot more than just 5.
Yes. It ended up being a formation of birds or ducks, right?
Thought it was like a reflection of sunlight off of clouds or something like that.
Okay, maybe I'm thinking of something else, but
Yeah, no, I mean, but like it was an error, a technical error, right? And
yeah.
fortunately, he used his head. But you know, like this is also the U.S. is deploying intermediate range Pershing II missiles, which are further spooking the Soviets. This is the context in which this happens, and there's this major exercise called Able Archer, which is meant to simulate what a nuclear war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact would look like. And so it starts with like a proxy conflict in the Middle East, and then Soviet troops get involved in Eastern Europe, and then chemical weapons are used. And then NATO retaliates against some Eastern Bloc cities, and then it escalates to full blown nuclear. And it was meant to be pretty realistic. The argument is there's a few things. One, there's a KGB defector who later claimed, yeah, like the Soviet higher ups were extremely worried about this. And so they were on like hair trigger alert, and we almost had an accidental nuclear war. And then
Whoops.
part of the idea is, hey, actually, you know, part of Soviet military planning was to use military exercise as a ruse to disguise a legitimate mobilization. So you can
And by the way, that's what happened prior to the Ukraine war.
well, and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, I think was part of what they did too. So this is the claim is like the Soviets really thought this was a legitimate NATO preparation for a preemptive nuclear strike. And what I really like about this article is he goes very deeply into the sources, including on the Warsaw Pact side, and basically says there's nothing to see here. That the members of the general staff later said that this KGB defector who spread this story was basically trying to ingratiate himself with the West. It shouldn't be taken at face value. That they didn't really view this as anything out of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there were some special alerts that happen, but really, like that's to be expected when the other side is conducting war games in an important theater. Of course, there's going to be some alerting that goes on.
Yeah, typically, I think during the Cold War, often it was the case that the one side would notify the other that exercises were happening because we had the red telephone, the hotline, right? For to sort of de-escalate this type of situation. Nobody was interested in starting an accidental nuclear war, and they're still
Yeah.
not. Number one. Number two, I think it's important. Like, this is an important case because it underlines the fact that in this bilateral relationship between NATO and Russia slash the USSR, there have been provocations on both sides over a long period of time. And Able Archer is actually a provocation by NATO towards the USSR or Russia, even though it kind of wasn't intended to be. It was maybe
I mean, I actually found the article very convincing. So it doesn't seem like it was actually all that provocative. It was just
yeah.
worry. I mean, the other piece of this he mentions is this thing called Operation Ryan, which was the Soviets were legitimately worried about the security of their second strike nuclear capability because the U.S. had made all these incredible technological developments in recent years. So this was supposed to be a major intelligence effort to be able to prevent the West from launching a preemptive first strike. And the KGB defector said, yeah, this was intelligence coming from Operation Ryan. He basically says that this never amounted to much and certainly wasn't much in 1983. Like, yes, it was a priority, but it appears in terms of early warning, it was never all that effective for the Soviets. And in 1983, he says it was still kind of in the R&D phase.
Right.
So this is all to say, like, I don't even know if that counts as a case, but it is one that appears frequently in the historical records. So I guess it's important to get it right.
Yeah, totally.
And then the very last one, which I'll spend less time on, but might arguably be the most relevant for today, is the, if not Russian state organized and directed, Moscow was sympathetic to large scale cyber attacks that were carried out against Estonia in 2007.
Yeah.
This is, arguably a better case because it involves newer technologies, right? This recent one on Poland was drones. The Estonia one was via cyberspace. It was a kind of gray zone, irregular warfare type effort. It was significant. it hit a large number of Estonian organizations and government websites. It was mainly what's called the distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS, where you just flood sites with so much web traffic that it causes them to crash and therefore not available for other people to use them. But it didn't, blow up any critical infrastructure or anything like that. So maybe that's a good case. But even here, I would say, I think it's pretty clear that the Kremlin was sympathetic to these cyber attacks, but it looks like they might not initially. I don't think we totally have ever proven that it was directed by the Russian government, but they certainly made no effort to round up the perpetrators of it. Not at all. The other thing is, this was in response to Estonia removing a World War II era Soviet statue that was in the capital, Tallinn.
That's all it took? Jeez.
Yeah, and they moved it to like a nearby military cemetery along with the graves of some Soviet soldiers from World War II. And this led to, this backlash, which is very different from what probably provoked this most recent incident in.
Yeah.
But that
let's
one
talk about that.
seems more similar than the other ones.
Totally. Yeah. Like in terms of provocation and why the Russians might have wanted to do something like this, assuming that it was not an accident. I think you and I both agree that it probably wasn't. Although there is like a sliver of a chance, right?
Sure,
that
but
it could have been. But that's the whole point. It's plausible. It's like, yes, it is
right.
plausible that 19 drones malfunctioned and were jammed or whatever. Yes, it is within the realm of possibility. It's just very unlikely. So a couple things are happening. One is that there have been movements, not successful movements yet, but movements towards peace talks in the Ukraine war. And Russia and Vladimir Putin want to establish the upper hand in these peace talks. They certainly do not want European troops, American troops, NATO troops stationed in Ukraine as part of this peace deal. And they've said that that's unacceptable. By the way, this is the only way a peace deal would work. So, they've set out this as a red line, and this type of provocation could be a way of demonstrating that NATO kind of won't put its money where its mouth is, right? It's like, we just hit Poland with drones. They didn't do anything, right? And it was a semi-accident, right? But just imagine what happens to your troops if they're in Ukraine. We'll hit them. And they've said as much. They've said anybody in Ukraine is a legitimate target. The Russians are
in no uncertain terms. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely certain. And, especially before a ceasefire, but even after a ceasefire, it's they're not interested. And, I have to remind everybody that Poland is one of the major forward operating bases for NATO supplying Ukraine. And it has been the case historically that if you are supplying a belligerent in a war, that makes you a belligerent too. And that is not the case in the Ukraine war, at least not yet. But it has been the case ultimately in earlier wars, including World War II and World War I. Both wars started for the United States in Europe when the Germans got sick of the United States supplying the Allies, right? And eventually went to war with them. So that could happen again here. Although I don't think anybody is super interested in that. The Russians have an interest in stopping the supply of Ukraine and certainly preventing the NATO provisioning of Ukraine during a peace deal. Another kind of interesting aspect of this involves Belarus. And I was reading about this a little bit. So Belarus is basically a Russian province at this point. It like fairly recently was an independent country, formerly part of the Soviet Union, but an independent country run by this dictator named Alexander Lukashenko. Now it's a quote unquote union state with Russia. So it's, Lukashenko is still in charge, but Russia gets to station troops in Belarus and in fact use Belarus as a staging ground to invade Ukraine. So Belarus is important. Apparently, the Trump administration has been reaching out to Lukashenko to see if Lukashenko would be interested in making a deal, a separate deal, that would kind of take him out of the orbit of Russia. Yes. So this has been reported. And this would weaken Russia because Belarus in addition to having power in its own right, not very much. It's a much smaller country, but it's very strategically located on the border with Poland, also the Baltics, also Ukraine. So it's important that Russia have unlimited access to Belarus. And surely Putin doesn't like Lukashenko making overtures towards the West or vice versa. So sending these drones through Belarusian airspace also sends a message.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I find that actually quite plausible. It's like, back off of my guy.
And didn't Belarus initially say it was an accident?
Yes, and that's kind of what you'd expect,
right,
from Lukashenko being worried that like the jig is up to a certain extent, and he got caught with his burner phone or whatever. And Putin's not happy about it, right? But yeah, if the Trump administration or the West were able to detach Belarus from Russia in some way, that would really weaken Russia going into the peace talks or continuing the war. It would be a big deal.
Yeah.
Right. So this could be a message to the West and to Belarus. It's like, do not, be talking.
In general, I don't think any of these explanations are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons to do it, right?
Like another one is just he being Putin is sort of feeling out what Trump's response is going to be here, because
that might be the biggest one.
I agree, because like if he can show the Europeans that there's a new sheriff in town who is going to take a very different approach than has traditionally been the case, that might soften up European policy, because the Europeans are arguably being a lot more insistent that there be much more stronger security guarantees for Ukraine than the United States currently is.
But they can't do it independently. They're behind the 8 ball, right? They're rearming, but as we've talked about extensively, they're 5 to 10 years away.
Yeah. And I would argue, this was reported, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, Denmark just decided it's not going to sign a contract for US-made Patriot air defense technology. It's going to go with a European supplier, which could be taken as an indication that the Europeans are starting to hedge their bets on the United States, and they need to like be more independent when it comes to military innovation and supply.
For sure, but like there's only so far they can hedge.
Absolutely. Right? I'm just saying it's an indication of the Europeans are under no illusions, I think, at this point, that U.S. policy is going to be the same as it has been for many years up until this point.
Trump's response has been ambiguous, as is often the case when we're talking about Russia versus Ukraine versus Europe, right? His first tweet was a Seinfeldian, "What's the deal with that?" Like, it was literally like, "What's the deal?" Yes, what's the deal with Russian drones crashing into Poland? That was the first part of the tweet. And then the second part of the tweet was the phrase, "Here we go."
Wow.
Which means everything and nothing.
I missed that. I have no idea how to interpret that.
Yeah, I think that was the point. It was just like, okay, so like, where do we go? Are we going to war? Are we going to do nothing? So far, it's been nothing, right? But it was really weird.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, you can't say the guy's not unpredictable.
It was a statement that communicated nothing. Like, it was, and like, if you think about it, there's an art to doing that, and he's pretty good at it.
Yeah, I mean, look, two other things I had in here. One, I can't claim as my own idea. Like, I think I read it maybe in the New York Times. I have to double check, but like that this is creating a bargaining chip for the negotiations on Ukraine. Hey, we will stop doing this to NATO countries, right? Like basically creating facts on the ground that Putin can then say, all right, as part of this deal, we'll stop doing that if you horse trade with us on these other things that we want. The other thing is there was this long kind of tortured debate during the Biden administration on how far to go in terms of supplying Ukraine with weaponry that could be used to inflict damage within Russian territory itself.
That's a big one.
And that kind of steadily like moved more and more toward, hey, that's too provocative. That could escalate toward, okay, we're going to supply that technology in a number of cases. And maybe this is the Russians saying like, okay, if you're okay, giving Ukraine the ability to attack us directly, like we can do it too, or at
Yep.
least signal as a warning.
Yep. And I like the fact that none of the drones actually exploded, I think is a dead giveaway because
Yeah.
that would have been an unacceptable act of war and provocation, right? These were all seemingly dummies and decoys, which is what really makes me think that this was like a warning shot surrounding all of these issues. And to your point, I believe the Europeans, at least the European members of NATO, have allowed unlimited use of the Ukrainians for their long range strike technologies. The Germans have, the British have, the French have, and they all have sort of long range cruise missiles and surface to surface strike technologies that they've given the Ukrainians. So the gloves are off there. I'm actually less sure about where the US stands as far as that goes.
Well, so I mean, I should really know this, but the U.S. ended up supplying ATACMS
Attackums.
under
Yep.
Biden. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of discussions about whether to supply sophisticated fighter jets that could penetrate Russian, airspace. Yeah, I mean, this was why that debate existed in the first place during the
Mm-hmm.
Biden administration was, well, this is classic alliance politics. If you're going to give your ally the ability to do something independently of you, you might then be on the hook for their actions.
Exactly. By the way, a quick aside on munitions naming. So the British sort of long range strike, I think it's a cruise missile, is called the Storm Shadow. That's really cool. The German one is called the Taurus. So the
Okay.
bull. I also like that. The American is it's an acronym, but it's pronounced ATACM,
Yeah.
which I just think is hilarious. It's actually a 5-letter acronym that stands for something.
God, I should know this, but I've looked this up a million times.
Yeah, I'm gonna attack.
Army Tactical No, wait. Army Tactical Missile System. Yeah.
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 Army Tactical Missile System, which is super lame, but it's pronounced ATACM. So I just thought kind of funny, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think at a minimum, we can say, again, we don't know. We only know what's out in the public record.
Right.
But like you said, I think that this probably was not an accident.
Probably not.
I would even say like quite probably.
Yes.
And I think I would be confident conjecturing that this is tied to the war in Ukraine pretty directly.
Yep. I think those are both fairly safe bets.
I don't think it's just an act of like revenge, if for no other reason that like they didn't really attack anything. I think it is, as you said, a signaling mechanism to influence the bargaining that's going on Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a message, right? I've already talked about Clausewitz on this show. It's like war
No,
is the
that's the single most important theorist of war of all time, man. So,
absolutely. War is the continuation of politics by other means, right? So if you think about like a spectrum with politics on one end and war on the other, the gray zone is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Right? It's drones that don't kill anybody and we're actually decoys. But they're a type of drone that Russia is producing an absolute ton of at this point. They're a type of drone that Russia sends literally hundreds of into Ukraine every single day at this point. They have plenty of supply of these things. And they sent a like what 2 to 5% into Poland, what they usually send into Ukraine. Poland couldn't deal with it. They freaked out and they shut down their airspace for half a day. They were completely unprepared. So
yeah.
that
and
I think
I got this from the Council on Foreign Relations. I just think it's worth mentioning. I just wanted to double check the figure. It doesn't cost the Russians much to make these things. Costs
not at all.
$35,000, whereas these missiles that are being scrambled to shoot them down can cost close to $1 million or more, and the jets are obviously expensive. So maybe also a way of flexing asymmetrically that we can do much lower costs than you can, at least for the moment.
Or just imagine what would happen to Poland if we started sending hundreds of these that actually
Right.
exploded
Yeah.
towards Poland every day. Like, what's Poland going to do? Poland's not going to look so good, right?
Yeah.
Like, NATO's not ready for this. So NATO needs to really think about that.
Well, and also like Trump and Putin just met last month in Alaska. I
Hmm.
couldn't tell you what they discussed privately. It could be directly signaling to Trump as well, right? I mean, it's like
Hmm.
sending multiple signals to the Europeans. Hey, like the US isn't there necessarily to have your back anymore, depending on what Trump's response is.
Hmm.
But also a message to Trump, like, we know that you have a core constituency that the last thing they want is to get involved in a major conflict. Like, by the way, we have ways of escalating this that can put you in a bind. So maybe get your allies under control. Um,
Totally. And with these drones, they can target, US troops in Poland, for instance. There's currently 10,000 US troops in Poland, and Trump likes Poland because Poland is spending a ton on its military. I think between 4 and 5% of its
yeah,
GDP at
it's
this
it's one
point.
it's one of the leading spenders
Yeah.
in terms of GDP within the alliance. Yeah.
Yeah, and like Poland is also a big country with a like fairly sizable and growing economy. So that's not nothing. And he said, "Hey, if they want more troops, we'll put them in." Like
Yeah.
so Poland definitely has Trump's support at least for the time being.
And
And
the
so
other thing you said on salami tactics is like, I find it hard to believe that it was just a coincidence. I think I read that makes coffee makers. There was an American owned factory that the Russians blew up in Ukraine
oh wow.
recently.
Coffee. I mean, that's a gross provocation. We won't
Yeah.
stand for that.
But like, if it turns out that that was a signal, which I suspect it was, I don't know why
Yeah.
I'll be targeting an American coffee company other than the American piece of it. Although I like my caffeine as much as the next guy, like that is dipping the toe in the pool. Sending drones into Poland is like the whole foot is now, so right? Like maybe
Yep.
that's what's going on, like iteratively escalating a bit to see, how far they can go.
Perhaps not coincidentally, I'm also reading and reporting today that the Trump administration is now drawing up secondary sanctions, bigger ones, on India and China, up to 100% for purchasing Russian oil. So that's kind of a big deal.
Look, aside from the economics, we talked about this last time. I view that quite significant if one looks at it in grand strategic terms, right? Like,
Mhm.
if everyone thinks that the main US focus at this point should be the Indo-Pacific, again, pushing India farther away um, doesn't make a lot of sense, which would be an indication that he's taking pretty seriously the need to deal with the Russians with a little more oomph. But
Yeah, get them to the table. Of
yeah,
course, this could also just be a warning that's been leaked to the press and there's no
sure.
intention to actually do it.
Yeah.
I do think that he wants a deal to end the war in Ukraine, and now the ball is being passed back and forth in that arena. So
But
that's probably what this
can
is
I
part
just
of.
ask? I mean, I find it unlikely in the extreme that whether it's Poland or any other member of NATO would do something extremely provocative independently. I mean, the risks of doing that sort of without having consulted and gotten it approved, certainly with the United States, but with the other major European states for that reason would be extremely risky.
I don't think any individual European country has the wherewithal to do
No,
anything
but I mean, like
independently.
you would think of, standalone attacks on some piece of Russian infrastructure. Like again,
Not a
I
chance.
find this
Yeah.
scenario extremely unlikely, but like for the sake of analytical clarity, what would be the American reaction to that? I suspect it would be condemnation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that would be pretty bad for NATO as a whole, certainly, because the whole idea is we coordinate our actions and we discuss everything and we have a plan that we're aligned with. Any freelancing within that framework is just raises like existential question, I would
I'm
say.
only making the point, particularly because I often think that there is arguably too much stock put in the strategic value of alliances and that people consider the downsides. This is to say there's also an upside, which is one benefit of being in an alliance is you do gain some real degree of control over your allies' policy, though they also gain a measure of control over yours.
Right. And we see this perhaps in the Middle East with Israel to a certain extent.
We'll talk about that maybe on another episode.
On another episode.
That's
Yeah,
that's
not
a
right
that's
now.
a unique one in some ways.
Absolutely. Okay, cool. So drones over Poland, Article 4 invoked, and remains to be seen what happens next. But we got our eye on it.
Let's hope it doesn't get too exciting.
Yeah, exactly. All
Yeah.
right, till next time, this has been Global Tantrum.